Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 24th of February 2024. Thanks so much to JR who has done the mapping for us today. Really appreciate that. Let's get up what the map actually means. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen at the moment. Pause the video. Right, we will go to the northeastern sector. Well, actually, we're going to bypass it. It's going to be a relatively quick one tonight. I'm not going to go into granular detail. I'm not going to look at the ISW just because of time, really. Northeastern sector has been fairly stable recently compared to other areas. There was little bit of a change to Sinkivka and to the Liman directions, but nothing to report today in terms of my mapping sources. First mapping change comes in Bakhmut, where we can see that the Ukrainians have made, the Russians have made some quite substantial gains according to Suryat Matsuprov Russian mapper just to the south of Ivanivska. That is a slight concern, or very much a concern really, for those in the area. As Suryat Map says, the combats continue in the eastern part of Ivanivska. The Russian army took control over the forest belt south of it and north of Klishchivka. So that is this forest kind of area there. Fairly significant gains there for the Russians, and Ivanivska, which is this key settlement that is kind of halting that advance of the Russians through towards Chasiv. An important buffer zone, just like Bodanivka. It's important that the Ukrainians keep the Russians at bay pretty much where they are at the moment. Any further advances to the east by the Russians will be, to the west, will give the Ukrainians a lot of work to do going forward. So, yep, that is where the Russians have moved forward over the last 24 hours. Then when we come down past New York and towards Avdiivka, we can see that the Russians are having continued success in this most active area of the front line. So they they've taken control over Stepova, as according to Suryat Maps, and they've made some gains as according to Andrew Perpetua in the same area. He's not as confident with the claims as Suryat Maps, but I think generally the Russians are just going to be moving westwards here, all across this front, all across this sector, and that is a real challenge because Badichi, Semenivka, Orlivka and Tonyenka are going to be next in the crosshairs for the Russians. Apparently, they have taken control over Siverny, which is a real challenge for the Ukrainians. The Russians have taken control, although not quite fully theirs according to Suryat Maps, but both mappers have at least some of it under their control, and Lastochkerna as well. Now, this could be, JL has done the mapping, but there has been some movements recently, so we'll have a look to see whether Suryat Maps has taken it any further. We have some gains all across that central part there. Suryat Map says the Russian army have taken full control over Lastochkerna with the capture of the village. The situation of the Ukrainian army in Siverny has become more complicated, and the troops have practically withdrawn from this locality as well. We'd heard previously that Lastochkerna was under a lot of pressure. Max 23 here saying, according to reports from the places, the armed forces had to leave there. The Ukrainian armed forces left there, and that allowed the Russians to move in. Then we've had a further confirmation from Suryat Maps that the Russian army took control over Stepova to the north as well. And moreover, the Ukrainian army retreated from Lastochkerna, where the Russian forces are combing the locality. It's very possible, but at the end of the day, there will be an announcement about its capture. Situation is more complex in Siverny due to the proximity to Tonyenka, where Ukrainian troops are entrenched there, attacking Russian troops that are slowly advancing inside the locality. Then OSINT Defender has said more recently the Russian flag has been raised in the settlements of Lastochkerna and Siverny to the west of Avdiivka in the Donetsk region, following its capture earlier today by elements of the Russian ground forces after the total withdrawal of Russian forces. And no reports even says that Russia has occupied Lastochkerna, waiting for more confirmation about Siverny, but it seems Ukraine has left that hamlet as well. So that's this small village and the key one of Lastochkerna, which was holding the Russians back in the center there. That means you're going to see pretty much an equalizing of the front line from north from Stepova down to Siverny there. And these, as I say, this crescent of villages will be next on the Russians' agenda. So troubling in the Avdiivka area, but nothing that we weren't expecting. The Russians will be pushing the Ukrainians back further and further to their more established and dug-in defensive lines that I think exist back here. I don't know exactly where, but they are somewhere around here, several lines there. The question is, how well fortified are those lines? That is one of the criticisms that's been leveled against the Ukrainian forces as of late, that they didn't dig in the way that Russia dug in during the downtime. So when Ukraine were hoping to advance in that counter-offensive period, they were expecting to move 30 kilometers a day, and that meant I assume that they didn't build their defensive lines in their positions that they were in originally, because they thought they're just going to be advancing through the Russian lines and there's no point building defenses. And the problem is 6 months later and they haven't moved, and those defenses weren't particularly focused upon. They are left with now being on the defensive, and the Russians are pushing, and they're pushing pretty hard. And the Ukrainians could find themselves in quite a bit of trouble due to the fact that they have not done that fortification building. Now, some good news around Solodka here, as according to Suryat maps, we have them claiming, and indeed Deep State map, that the Ukrainian army launched a counterattack and recaptured the positions previously taken by the Russian army last week west of Solodka. And that's some fairly sizable areas of farmland taken back by the Ukrainians. That keeps the Russians at bay there and maybe helps Novomykhailivka a little bit. You can see that Novomykhailivka is in a lot of trouble. Pobyeda has been taken, and this whole area, sort of north of Konstantinivka, is under pressure. Well, the area to the south of Konstantinivka, I think you can see that the Ukrainians don't want the Russians to be able to encircle Konstantinivka and get closer to this road that will really threaten Vuhledar as well. So that's possibly why the Ukrainians are pushing back there. You would imagine they want to keep the lines where they are for sure at the moment, because that road and Konstantinivka are sort of key for the Ukrainians to be able to get their HIMARS to attack Mariupol down here, and just it has some value in the supplies to all of these areas: Vodyane, Vuhledar, Konstantinivka, and the troops further in here in these pockets. So, yep, the Ukrainians have pushed back there. Now we come on to Robotyne. Robotyne is not looking good in terms of what Suryat maps in particular is saying. The Russians have been pushed. The Ukrainians have been pushed out of large areas of land, and arguably Robotyne is being, is fighting in the center of Robotyne as well. The Suryat maps claim here is the situation in Robotyne as the Ukrainian army. No, that's wrong. Is that the Russian army has broken Ukrainian defenses, taking control of over 40% of the locality of Robotyne. In addition, troops are advancing from the east, moving the Ukrainian army, or forcing the Ukrainian army to start their withdrawal from the salient, I presume, as a whole. In addition, the withdrawal is taking place in the last area of the Surovikin line, out of Russian control. It's expected that the front will be leveled in the next hour. So that's this area I was talking about previously. So we go to my map. You have this area where you've got the Surovikin line. These are the tank lines. That's the Dragon's Teeth and then the tank ditch that the Ukrainians still have control of. And I was saying that's not going to be long, really. It's not going to be long until the Russians take that back. And I think what you're seeing is effectively an operational withdrawal, probably back out of this entire salient eventually. I've been quite surprised that the Ukrainians have held on to this area for so long, and it could be the kind of sunk cost fallacy that it took them so much to take Robotyne that just giving up to the Russians easily was a kick in the teeth. But I think it doesn't offer intrinsic value, this area, other than, I guess, the extrinsic value of offering a larger salient and focus for the Russian forces so that they don't focus more explicitly on Orikhiv, and that could be why the Ukrainians have remained there. So as long as the fighting is here, it's kept further away from Orikhiv. So that's the situation on the front line. No changes to the Krinky area. still fairly active. Quite a bit of footage coming out of Krinky, drone footage I've seen quite a bit of drone activity from Magyard's Birds and other Ukrainian units operating there. So there's still, attriting the Russian forces as much as possible, but it's one of those places where I can't imagine the Ukrainians are gonna hang on to that for much longer. But no explicit news that I've seen of that area today. So let me know what you think, what you feel about the Ukrainians' position at the moment, and what you think about the Russians and whether they have. I mean, the Russians have done some fairly, someone's asked me to do an analysis of the Russian attack on Avdiivka and the fact that it was competent combined armed maneuver. I don't think it was competent combined armed maneuver. I think it was just overwhelming the Ukrainians. I think what they did well was get into those water pipes underneath the Tsarska Ohota restaurant complex that allowed the troops to come up behind the Ukrainians and really cause them an issue. So I think this area here, it's not rendering them for some reason, but it allowed the Russians to come up behind the Ukrainians and cause them all sorts of issues. There were quite a large number of troops that did that, fairly heavily armed. And although the Ukrainians did push them back, when the Russians started pushing in lots of different areas all at once, and particularly up around here, without artillery ammunition, the Ukrainians weren't able to hold on. Now, had the Ukrainians had umpteen rounds or 1,000 rounds of ammunition, then I think Avdiivka would still be broadly where it was previously. I think you can put the loss of Avdiivka, not down to any decent maneuvers from the Russians, but from just a massive lack of ammunition, as has been widely reported by artillery crews in the area, and that surprise attack and an overwhelming number. So the Russians lost huge numbers of people and huge numbers of equipment here, and they have been losing it since October. I don't think the Russians should pat themselves on the back for an incredibly successful combined arms maneuver campaign. They although what they did very well, it depends whether you pat yourself on the back for flattening somewhere, but they flattened Avdiivka with aviation, and the Ukrainians just didn't have at the time the aviation air defense to deal with that. I mean, they did technically. The question I've often asked is, when we do see the Patriots suddenly turn up and do those surprise attacks and take down some airplanes, and I'm not saying it's a Patriot that took down the A-50 down around the Krasnodar region, because I don't think it can reach that far. The claim is it's an S-200, modified S-200, or it was the Russians firing their own air defense at the A-50 with S-200s in the area too. Nonetheless, we have seen the Patriots turn up. The question is, why did it turn up? And one did turn up at the end and took down all those Sioux jets. We saw 5 lost in 3 days, was it? Maybe another couple last night. The question was, why did it take so long for that to turn up? And there must be some good reason for it. But that allowed the Russians to just keep hammering the Ukrainians. So if you want to say that's good combined arms maneuvers, I suppose you can. They did use troops, equipment, as in they did use quite a lot of mechanized equipment, and they did use artillery fairly effectively. But they also the reason I'm not saying it's good use is because they just lost tremendous troops in so doing. So yeah, there was some competence, but essentially they massively overwhelmed the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians didn't have an answer because they had no artillery ammunition, and they couldn't bring the air defense in quick enough to take out the airframes. So that's the story of Avdiivka. I think it would have been a very different story had they had artillery ammunition and if they had been able to bring in a Patriot system a week earlier. But that's counterfactuals and what ifs and hypotheticals. But yeah, let me know what you think, guys. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all your support. Take care. Speak soon.